I was 72 years old when I discovered that someone had quietly buried me under $87,000 of debt. And the worst part was that the person who did it was my own daughter. I didn't know that yet when the message first appeared on my phone. Sitting there in the pale blue glow of the screen, while the rest of my house slept in silence. But by the end of that night, the truth would begin to unfold in a way that would change everything I thought I knew about my family. Nights in an old house when the quiet feels heavier than usual. The kind of quiet where even the ticking of the kitchen clock sounds louder than it should. That night was one of those nights. I was sitting alone at the kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea that had gone cold hours earlier. The lamp above the sink casting a small circle of yellow light across the table, while the rest of the room sat in soft shadows. My phone buzzed once beside my hand, and when I picked it up, I expected something ordinary, maybe a reminder from the bank about my mortgage application, or a message asking for additional paperwork. Instead, I saw a sentence that made my stomach drop in a way I cannot fully describe. Mortgage application has been denied due to outstanding debt under your name. I simply stared at the screen, convinced I had misunderstood something. At my age, you learn to recognize certain feelings immediately. The tightening in the chest, the hollow drop in your stomach, the quiet voice in your mind whispering that something is very wrong. I set the phone down on the table because my hands had started trembling. Then I picked it up again and read the message slowly, word by word, hoping the meaning would somehow change the second time. And the bank was telling me that I owed money. Not a small mistake, not a missed payment, but a number so large that it looked unreal sitting there on the screen. $7,000. Debt I had never created. For nearly 40 years, I had lived the careful life women of my generation were taught to live. Pay your bills on time. Never borrow more than you must. Save what you can for the future, because someday you might need it. After my husband died 8 years ago, I became even more careful. Every receipt folded neatly into a kitchen drawer. Every payment scheduled a week early. Every dollar accounted for. It wasn't an exciting life, but it was a responsible one. And by the time I turned 72, I had finally gathered the courage to apply for a small mortgage on a modest cottage just outside town. Nothing grand, just 2 bedrooms, a narrow porch with white railings, and a small patch of yard where I imagined planting tomatoes in the summer. I spent 6 years saving for that house. 6 years working part-time at the library, skipping little luxuries, putting aside small amounts of money each month, the way people slowly fill a jar with coins. The day I submitted the mortgage application, I felt something I had not felt in a long time. a quiet sense that perhaps the next chapter of my life might still hold something gentle and peaceful. Oh, the bank was telling me that dream had already been destroyed, and the attached credit report with fingers that would not stop shaking. The screen loaded slowly, line by line, and as the details appeared, my heart began beating harder with every new entry. Credit cards, 2 personal loans, all opened in the past 14 months, all in my name. I simply sat there in the quiet kitchen, staring at the glowing numbers, while the ticking clock on the wall counted the seconds of a life that suddenly felt unfamiliar. The strangest part was not the debt itself, but the realization creeping slowly into my thoughts, because there was something about the dates that felt wrong, something about the timing that stirred an uncomfortable memory in the back of my mind. Months ago, that was the week my daughter Caroline came to help me renew the lease on this house. That right here at this very table, while I gathered the documents the landlord required, my driver's license, my social security card, my bank statements, all the little pieces of paper that prove who you are in this world. At one point, she had taken the folder from me and walked down the hallway toward the printer, saying she needed to make copies so everything would be ready for the landlord's office. Remember, she was gone for several minutes. Only one person who had walked down that hallway with my identification. One person who had the opportunity to become me on paper. My own daughter, Caroline. Just thinking the possibility made my throat tighten, because people always assume betrayal comes from strangers, criminals, people who have nothing to lose. They never imagine it could come from someone whose baby pictures still sit on your bookshelf, someone whose childhood drawings are still tucked inside an old photo album in the living room cabinet. Deeper I looked into that credit report, the harder it became to ignore what the evidence was quietly telling me. It wasn't an accident. This wasn't confusion. Someone had very carefully built an entire life of debt using my name. First part, the part that kept my hands shaking as I sat there in the silence, was the growing understanding that I might not be the only person who knew the truth. What I would learn over the next few days was even more painful than the debt itself. Her own family had been protecting her, while my future quietly collapsed under a mountain of loans I never agreed to, protecting her while my credit was destroyed, protecting her while the house I had spent 6 years saving for slipped quietly out of reach. Truth is, this story did not begin with the debt. And many years earlier, in ways I failed to recognize at the time, with the difference between my two daughters. One who learned very young how to charm a room full of people, and another who learned how to disappear quietly into the background. I understood that difference sooner. By the time I finished reading that credit report, one thing was already clear in my mind, whether I wanted to accept it or not. Someone had used my name to open those accounts. Someone had typed in my information, filled out the forms, and quietly built a life of debt that legally belonged to me. And whoever did it understood exactly what they were doing, because the accounts were spread across different lenders, opened slowly over time, just enough distance between them so that no single bank would immediately raise suspicion. This was completely silent around me, the kind of silence that presses against your ears when you are alone after midnight. And I sat there staring at the glowing screen while the numbers refused to change. $87,000. The number looked unreal, almost like a mistake that would disappear if I blinked hard enough. But as I scrolled through the report, reading each line slowly, something far more disturbing began to appear. Every account had been opened within a few weeks of something very specific. Caroline visited. At first, I tried to push the thought away, because no mother wants to follow a suspicion like that to its final destination. But once the idea entered my mind, it refused to leave, and the more I looked at the dates, the more that quiet dread began to grow. I have two daughters. Caroline is the older one, 4 years ahead of her sister, and from the time she was a little girl, she carried a kind of natural confidence that made people notice her immediately. She had the sort of personality that fills a room without effort, the kind of bright charm that makes strangers smile and lean closer when she speaks. My husband used to say she could probably sell umbrellas during a drought if she really wanted to, and everyone who met her believed it. Younger sister, Emily, was different in almost every way. She never tried to become the center of attention. She preferred quiet corners, books, long, thoughtful conversations with one person, rather than lively rooms filled with 20. If Caroline was sunshine pouring through open windows, Emily was the soft glow of a lamp beside a chair where someone sits and reads late into the evening. I loved them both with the same fierce devotion every mother carries in her heart, but the world responded to them very differently. The world adored Caroline, and over time, Caroline learned how to live inside that admiration. By the time she reached her 20s, she had built a life that looked perfect from the outside. She worked in real estate, always dressed beautifully, drove a car that was newer and shinier than mine. And whenever she came to visit, she carried the calm confidence of someone who had everything under control. She would arrive with pastries from expensive bakeries, flowers for the kitchen table, thoughtful little gifts that made people smile and say what a wonderful daughter she was. In town, talked about her constantly. Oh, Gloria, they would say whenever we ran into each other at church or the grocery store. You must be so proud of Caroline. Always smiled and said that I was, because I truly believed it. But pride can quietly blind you to things you should probably notice. 2 years ago, something began to change in Caroline, though I didn't understand it at the time. She started visiting more often than usual, sometimes stopping by in the evenings after work, sometimes calling late at night just to talk. During those conversations, she began asking small questions about paperwork and finances, the kind of questions that sounded perfectly reasonable coming from an adult daughter who wanted to help her aging mother stay organized. Where do you keep your important documents? She asked one night. Time, she asked about my credit score. Time, she asked how long I had been saving for the little cottage I hoped to buy someday. I thought she was simply taking an interest in my plans, maybe even looking out for me, the way grown children sometimes do when they start worrying about their parents getting older. Back now, those conversations feel very different. 14 months ago, on a gray, rainy Saturday morning, Caroline arrived at my house carrying 2 cups of coffee and a bright, cheerful smile. She set the cups on the kitchen table and said she wanted to help me organize the paperwork I needed for the lease renewal and the mortgage application I had been preparing. You shouldn't have to deal with all this alone, she said warmly. At one point, Caroline gathered the papers together and stood up from the table. Copies on your printer in the hallway, she said casually. I remember watching her walk down the hallway, holding that folder. And later, I heard the printer start. It ran for only a few seconds. But Caroline stayed in that hallway much longer. 5 minutes passed, nearly 10 minutes before she returned to the kitchen. Came back, she handed the folder to me with a bright, reassuring smile and said everything was ready. Check the documents. I didn't count the pages. I didn't question the delay. I trusted her. But now, 14 months later, sitting alone in the dim kitchen light with the cold tea still untouched beside my hand, that memory replayed in my mind with a terrible new meaning, because the first credit card listed on that report had been opened only 3 days after that visit. Days, which meant something I had not yet fully allowed myself to believe. I had not stumbled into this. She had planned it. Realization was something even worse began forming slowly in the back of my mind. A quiet question that refused to leave. If Caroline had truly been doing this for over a year, opening accounts in my name, building debts that I would eventually have to face, then how had no one else noticed? These talk, sisters talk, hidden forever. Later that night, after staring at the credit report until the numbers began to blur together, I finally gathered the courage to call my younger daughter. Answered on the third ring. For a moment, I couldn't bring myself to say the words, my fingers gripping the phone while my heart pounded in my chest. Finally asked her the moment Emily went quiet on the phone. Something inside me shifted in a way I cannot fully explain. The kind of quiet instinct that arrives before the truth finally shows itself. It wasn't just the silence that frightened me. It was the way she held that silence. The way she didn't immediately ask questions or sound confused by what I had just told her. Mothers learn to hear things that are never spoken out loud. And in that long pause on the other end of the line, I felt the first heavy crack forming in the story I had believed about my family. I said slowly, trying to keep my voice steady, even though my fingers were trembling around the phone. Please tell me if you know what this is about. For seconds, all I could hear was her breathing. It was a faint, uneven sound, like someone standing in a dark room trying to decide whether to open a door they had been avoiding for a very long time. She let out a quiet sigh. Not the sigh of someone confused. The sigh of someone exhausted from carrying a secret. She said softly, I was hoping you wouldn't find out like this. Words settled over me like cold air drifting through an open window. For a moment, I couldn't even form a reply. My eyes dropped to the kitchen table, where the light from my phone was still glowing faintly beside the cold cup of tea. I asked. Emily hesitated again, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the heavy uncertainty of someone who had been wrestling with this moment for months. Caroline would fix it before it got this bad. Suddenly felt smaller around me. The quiet kitchen that had always felt safe now seemed strangely unfamiliar, as if the walls themselves had been listening to a story I was only just beginning to hear. She would fix it, I repeated slowly. Emily said. She paused again, carefully choosing each word. She told me a few months ago that she had borrowed some money using your credit. She said it was temporary, just until she could close a big real estate deal. She promised she would pay everything back. Inside my mind requires permission. Borrowing requires honesty. What had happened here was something very different. And you believed her? I asked quietly. Emily's answer came after another long silence. I wanted to believe her. There was pain in the way she said it, the kind of pain that told me she had probably been questioning that decision for a long time. It sounds small, Emily continued slowly. She said it was only a few $1,000s. She said the bank would never even notice because she would pay it off before anyone realized what happened. $1,000. The number glowing on my phone screen was 87,000. I whispered, my voice barely louder than the ticking clock on the wall. It's not a few thousand. Sharp intake of breath on the other end of the call. Which is it? She asked quietly. $87,000. For a moment, Emily didn't speak at all. Then, a small broken sound escaped her. God. The silence that followed was heavy and uncomfortable. I could hear the refrigerator humming behind me, the steady ticking of the clock marking seconds that suddenly felt much longer than they should. Emily spoke again. Mom, there's something else. Those 4 words tightened something deep in my chest. What is it? I asked. Caroline asked me not to tell you. The kitchen seemed colder suddenly. She said you would panic, Emily continued quietly. She said it would stress you out and that she would take care of everything before you even noticed. Or I even noticed. 14 months of secret credit accounts. 14 months of debt. My hands began trembling again as the full weight of that realization settled over me. For 72 years, I had believed something very simple about family, that when trouble appeared, people told the truth to the ones they loved. Another thought had begun creeping quietly into my mind. Emily had known about this for 8 months. Then Caroline had probably been doing it for much longer. My own daughter could hide $87,000 of debt under my name. Had she been hiding from me all this time? The call with Emily ended that night. I remained sitting at the kitchen table for a long time without moving. The house had fallen completely silent around me, the kind of deep quiet that settles over an old home after midnight. The lamp above the sink cast its small circle of warm yellow light across the table. But nothing about that light felt comforting anymore. Thought kept repeating itself inside my mind. To hear the truth from Caroline herself, from Emily, not from a credit report, from the daughter who had walked down my hallway 14 months earlier, carrying a folder that held my entire identity. Fingers hovered over my phone for several seconds before I finally opened my contact list. When I saw Caroline's name on the screen, a wave of old memories rushed unexpectedly through my mind. The first day I walked her to school, holding her small hand. The afternoons she ran into the house with grass stains on her knees and stories she couldn't wait to tell. The way she used to laugh when her father lifted her high into the air in the backyard. Moment, I almost put the phone down. But I knew I couldn't. So I pressed the call button. The phone rang twice before she answered. "Hey, Mom," Caroline said brightly, her voice warm and cheerful in that familiar, confident way. "Everything okay?" The sound of her voice twisted something painfully inside my chest. She sounded completely normal, relaxed even, like someone answering a casual evening call without the slightest idea that her secret life had just been exposed. "Fine," I said quietly. There was a small pause on the line. Something about my tone must have reached her, because the cheerful energy in her voice faded slightly. "Long?" she asked. I took a slow breath, steadying myself against the edge of the table. "Denied my mortgage application tonight." Another pause. Her response sounded polite, but something about it felt wrong. A mother knows the difference between genuine concern and careful distance. "Denied it because of debt under my name," I said slowly. The silence that followed stretched longer this time. Caroline spoke again. "How much debt?" Heavily between us, and asked if the bank made a mistake. She hadn't asked what debt I was talking about. She asked how much. I said. For seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Caroline exhaled quietly. Not shock, more like someone acknowledging a problem they had already been expecting. She said carefully, "I was planning to talk to you about that. Secret accounts." And she had been planning to mention it someday. I asked. There was another pause. The words sounded empty. My throat felt tight as I asked the question that had been sitting in my chest all evening. My voice barely sounded like my own. Caroline, did you open those accounts using my name? The silence that followed lasted long enough for the truth to arrive before the answer did. She spoke. Yes. No denial. Just the quiet confirmation that the daughter I had trusted with everything had quietly taken my identity and used it as if because if my daughter could calmly admit to stealing my identity and burying me under $87,000 of debt, perhaps the person I thought I had raised was someone I had never truly understood at all. First time in my life, I began to wonder something that no mother ever wants to ask herself. Was the daughter I believed I knew had never really existed. I didn't sleep that night. After the call with Caroline ended, the number on my phone screen kept replaying in my mind like something my brain refused to accept. $87,000. By morning, I knew there was only one place left to go: the bank. 9 o'clock, I was sitting in a small office at the branch where I had kept my accounts for nearly 20 years. Across the desk from me sat a young loan officer named Daniel, a polite man in his early 30s who spoke in the calm, measured tone people use when delivering difficult information. He folded his hands on the desk and looked at me with quiet sympathy before explaining the situation as gently as he could. According to the credit history attached to my social security number, the accounts had been legally opened under my identity. From the bank's perspective, the debt belonged to me. Daughter opened them, I said quietly. Daniel nodded, the way someone does when they have heard that explanation before. He wasn't dismissive, just careful. Understand that may be the case, he replied. But unless identity fraud is formally reported, the responsibility remains with the account holder. And right now, that account holder is you. The word felt heavy in my ears. Reporting fraud meant something very specific. It meant filing an official report. It meant investigators. It meant questions. And most of all, it meant accusing my own daughter of a crime. What happens if I don't report it? I asked. Daniel glanced at his screen and answered in the same steady voice. The debt remains attached to your credit profile. And until those balances are resolved, your credit rating will stay where it is now. And my mortgage application would remain denied. The small cottage I had been planning for 2 years would remain out of reach. The quiet retirement I had carefully saved for would disappear under someone else's decisions. For a long moment, I said nothing. The choice sitting in front of me felt impossible. If I protected Caroline, I would lose everything I had spent years building. If I reported her, she could face criminal charges that might follow her for the rest of her life. Something else you should see, Daniel said after a moment, and the computer screen slightly toward me and began scrolling through the account history connected to my name. As the transactions appeared line by line, a slow tightening sensation spread through my chest. Clothing stores, airline tickets, cities I had never visited. Purchases have been occurring regularly for over a year, Daniel explained. Most of the balances were maintained through minimum payments, which delayed detection. Year. That detail alone changed something inside my mind. This hadn't been a single desperate decision. It had been a pattern, a long one. Much of it has been paid back, I asked quietly. Studied the screen again. Very little, he said. Very little. For months, Caroline had been telling Emily that everything would be resolved soon, that a deal was about to close, that the money would be returned before anyone noticed. But looking at those transactions, it became painfully clear that the debt had never been shrinking. It had simply been growing more quietly. Anything else? I asked. Daniel hesitated briefly before answering. Yes, 2 additional loans were opened 3 weeks ago. Weeks. For a moment, the number didn't fully register as I walked out of the bank that morning. One realization kept repeating itself in my mind with uncomfortable clarity. Caroline was still lying to me. The records I had just seen made that impossible to ignore. She had told Emily she was about to close a deal that would fix everything. She had told me the same thing on the phone the night before. But 3 weeks ago, she had opened another loan in my name, which meant something very simple. She had never actually stopped. By the time I reached my car, I knew there was only one thing left to do. I needed to speak to her again. Not as the mother who had always trusted her, but as the person whose life she had quietly placed in danger. I dialed her number. She answered almost immediately. Mom, Caroline said, I was actually going to call you later. Her voice sounded casual, relaxed, as if the conversation from the night before had already faded into the background of her day. To the bank this morning, I said. There was a brief pause on the line. Oh, she replied. What did they say? They showed me the account history. Another pause followed, slightly longer this time. Mom, I told you I'm working on fixing everything, she said. I closed my eyes for a moment before continuing. 2 new loans were opened 3 weeks ago. Settled on the line. When she finally spoke again, the confidence in her voice had faded just a little. Yes, she admitted, But that was part of the same situation. The same situation. The words sounded practiced, like something she had already said to herself many times. Old Emily, this started a few months ago, I continued. The bank says the accounts began more than a year ago. I didn't answer right away. Things got complicated, she said eventually. Complicated. It was a small word for something that had already destroyed my credit and placed nearly $90,000 of debt under my name. Ever planning to stop? I asked quietly. The silence lasted longer. I told you I have a deal coming, she replied. Once it closes, everything will be fine. Promise again. The same vague reassurance she had apparently been repeating for months. Bill was coming. Everything would be fine. Soon. Gently. What deal? First time since the conversation began. She hesitated in a way that sounded real. Can't really talk about it yet. The answer was vague. Too vague. And in that moment, something inside my mind shifted in a way I cannot fully describe. After that second phone call with Caroline ended, I sat quietly in my car for several minutes with the phone still in my hand, replaying every word of the conversation in my mind. The confidence in her voice, the way she repeated the same promise about a deal that would supposedly fix everything. The careful vagueness whenever I asked for real details. The more I thought about it, the more a quiet uneasiness began settling inside me, because something about the entire explanation felt rehearsed, like a story she had practiced saying long before I ever discovered the debt. Someone else who had been living with this secret longer than I had. Same story for months. Then Emily might have seen things that I hadn't. She might know parts of this situation that Caroline had never intended for me to discover. That thought alone was enough to make me pick up the phone again. Answered after a few rings. Mom, did you talk to her again? Yes, I said. I also went to the bank this morning. Small shift in her, breathing on the other end of the line. Showed me the account history, I continued. The accounts started more than a year ago. Didn't sound surprised. I figured it was something like that, she admitted quietly. Her response made something inside my chest tighten. You knew? I asked. She said quickly. But Mom, there were signs. The air between us. Of signs? I asked carefully. Emily hesitated for a moment before answering, as if she had been hoping she would never have to say this part out loud. And started living differently last year, she said. More expensive clothes, weekend trips, restaurants she used to say were too overpriced. When I asked how she could afford it, she told me she was doing well with some investment deals. The same vague explanation she had just given me. It wasn't the part that worried me, Emily continued. On the phone tightened slightly. What was? Said. Letters, he explained. They started showing up at her apartment. I saw them on the counter a few times. Different banks, different loan companies. Oh, heavy feeling settled into my stomach. Letters, I asked. I don't know exactly, she admitted, but it was enough that I noticed. I stared out the windshield of my car while her words settled into place. I said slowly, "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" The answer came softly. Because she begged me not to. The honesty in her voice carried a painful mixture of guilt and frustration. She told me she had everything under control, Emily continued. She said one big investment was about to pay out, and that she would clear the debt before you ever knew it existed. Promise again. Soon. But something about Emily's tone suggested there was still more she hadn't said yet. I asked quietly, "Is there something else?" The pause that followed was longer this time. Yes, she admitted. What is it? He took a breath before continuing. About 2 months ago, I asked Caroline what would happen if the investment deal didn't work out. What did she say? I asked. She laughed, Emily said. Laughed. Strange, considering the seriousness of the situation. That conversation with Emily stayed with me the entire drive home. The idea that Caroline believed I would protect her no matter what had never crossed my mind before. But now that I thought about it, the pattern was difficult to ignore. She had opened account after account under my name for more than a year. She had promised repeatedly that everything would be fixed soon. And even after the situation had grown to nearly $90,000, she had still opened new loans only 3 weeks earlier. None of those decisions suggested someone who believed they might face real consequences. Suggested someone who believed they were safe. Time I pulled into my driveway, the quiet house waiting for me felt very different from the one I had left that morning. The same rooms were there, the same furniture, the same photographs on the walls showing my daughters growing up year by year. But now every memory carried a question behind it. When had Caroline become someone capable of this? Had I missed the signs, or had she simply hidden them well enough that I never had a chance to see? Still standing in the kitchen thinking about those questions when my phone rang again. His name appeared on the screen. For a moment, I simply stared at it. Then I answered, her voice slightly more urgent than before. I've been thinking about our conversation. Nothing waiting. I know this looks bad, she continued, but I need you to trust me. I'm closer to fixing this than you think. Words sounded almost identical to the promises she had been repeating since the night before. Exactly are you planning to fix it? I asked. Brief pause before she responded. I'm negotiating with someone right now, she said. Negotiating what? Replied. Once the paperwork is finalized, I'll be able to clear the entire balance. Explanation felt strangely vague again, filled with confident words, but very little detail. Fine, I said slowly. The bank told me something interesting today. In my tone must have caught her attention. She asked. They said some of the lenders connected to these accounts have already started asking questions, I continued. Large balances tend to attract attention eventually. Grew quiet for a moment. Then Caroline spoke again, but this time her voice sounded slightly less confident. That's normal when loans get large, she said. I asked. Another short silence followed. Mom, she said carefully, you haven't reported anything, have you? Question hung heavily between us. For the first time since this entire nightmare began, I realized something important about my daughter's confidence. All of her plans, all of her promises, all of the risks she had taken over the past year depended on one simple assumption. It would protect her. I took a slow breath before answering. No, I said, I haven't reported anything. The relief in her voice arrived instantly. Good. After my conversation with Caroline ended that afternoon, I sat quietly in the kitchen for a long time thinking about everything she had said. The explanation she kept repeating about a deal that would supposedly fix everything still echoed in my mind. But the more I replayed her words, the less convincing they sounded. For months, she had been promising Emily that an investment was about to close. That money was coming soon, that the entire situation would disappear before anyone noticed. Yet every time I asked for details, the answers became vague, unfinished, always just enough information to move the conversation somewhere else. Thought kept returning to me with growing discomfort. Caroline hadn't been worried about the debt during our conversation earlier. She had been worried about something else entirely. She had been worried about being reported. Realization pushed me to pick up the phone again and call the bank. Answered after a few rings, sounding slightly surprised to hear from me so soon. I explained that Caroline had been claiming an investment deal was about to close, something that would supposedly cover the entire balance attached to my credit. Daniel listened patiently before checking the account notes connected to the lenders involved in the loans. Seeing any scheduled transfers or settlement activity connected to those accounts, he said carefully, his voice calm in the same professional way he had spoken earlier that morning. But I can check something else for you. While he searched through the lender records. A few seconds, he spoke again, this time sounding more cautious. Lenders filed a preliminary inquiry yesterday, he explained. Sorry, I repeated. Yes, when balances reach a certain level and payments become irregular, lenders sometimes begin reviewing the information that was used to approve the loan. Uneasiness spread through my chest. What kind of review? I asked. In this case, they were attempting to verify the income listed on the loan application, Daniel said. Of those words settled slowly into place. I asked quietly. There was a brief pause before he answered. They weren't able to confirm it. My stomach dropped when he said that. You mean the income information might not be accurate? I asked. Make that determination myself, Daniel replied carefully. But when lenders cannot verify financial information, the situation can escalate. How? I asked. In more serious situations, it can be referred for fraud investigation, he explained. Investigation. The phrase landed heavily in the quiet kitchen around me. For several seconds, I didn't speak, because the situation had just become far more serious than I had realized earlier. Caroline had not only opened loans under my name, she might also have provided financial information that couldn't be verified by the lenders themselves. No one contacted the authorities yet, I asked slowly. See that in the system, Daniel said. But if lenders determine the information was intentionally inaccurate, that possibility always exists. Thanking him for the information, I ended the call and sat quietly with the phone resting in my hand. The picture that was forming in front of me was no longer just about debt or bad financial decisions. That evening, I called Caroline again, not because I wanted another argument, but because the pieces of the story had finally begun fitting together in a way that left very little room for confusion. The loans attached to my name, the expensive purchases Daniel had shown me in the transaction history, the income information lenders were now questioning, and the mysterious investment deal Caroline kept mentioning without ever explaining. All of it pointed toward the same uncomfortable conclusion. Answered the phone. Her voice sounded cautious. She said quietly, "I spoke with the bank again today," I told her. A brief silence followed before she responded. "Oh, what did they say?" Has already started reviewing the loan applications, I continued. Pause settled between us. They couldn't verify the income listed on the forms, I added. The silence that followed stretched longer than any we had shared during our earlier conversations. When Caroline finally spoke again, the confidence that had filled her voice before was noticeably weaker. "It's not as simple as it sounds," she said. I closed my eyes for a moment before answering. "Fine. I'm going to ask you something directly." Quiet pause. "Okay," she said. Coming, I continued slowly. "You told Emily the same thing. You said an investor was going to solve everything." She replied. My voice remained calm, but the weight behind the words was heavier than anything I had said before. "Actually, a deal, Caroline." For several seconds, there was no answer. When she finally spoke again, her voice sounded very different from the confident tone she had used all week. She admitted quietly. The word landed like a stone in my chest. "There was supposed to be," she continued slowly, "an investor promised to back a property project I was working on last year. I thought if the funding came through, I could clear the loans before anyone noticed what I had done." "It didn't happen," I said. "No," she whispered. Entire nightmare began. I heard something in her voice that had been missing before. "If I just had more time," she said. "When the first loan got too big, I opened another one to cover it. Then another. I thought eventually something would work out." Ruth settled slowly into place as she spoke. Not been fixing the problem. She had been stacking new debt on top of old debt. After Caroline admitted the truth that night, the conversation ended more quietly than I ever expected it would. There was no shouting, no desperate attempt from her to explain the situation away. Only a long stretch of silence that seemed to settle between us like something heavy and unavoidable. I remained sitting at the kitchen table long after the call ended, staring at the cold cup of tea in front of me, while the weight of what had just happened slowly settled into my chest. For months, my daughter had been building a fragile tower of promises, loans, and half-explained plans, always insisting that an investment deal would solve everything before anyone realized how far things had gone. Now that tower had collapsed, and the truth underneath it was far more serious than I had imagined. What troubled me most was not only the amount of money involved, although the number alone was enough to change the course of my retirement. What troubled me was the quiet realization that Caroline had never truly believed I would discover the situation in time to stop it. Somewhere along the way, she had begun assuming that even if the truth did come out, I would protect her from the consequences. Emily's words returned to my mind with uncomfortable clarity, reminding me that Caroline had always believed I would never allow anything serious to happen to her, no matter what she had done. For years, I had been the person who solved problems for my daughters, the person who stepped in when life became too complicated or too frightening for them to handle alone. Sitting there in the quiet kitchen, I began to understand that this situation was no longer a problem that could be quietly solved with patience or advice. The bank had already explained what could happen if lenders confirmed the information on the loan applications had been inaccurate. Investigations, legal reviews, financial consequences that might follow Caroline for years. The thought of my daughter facing that kind of future made my chest tighten. Yet another thought pressed just as strongly against my conscience. If I chose to ignore the situation, the debt would remain attached to my name, and the damage would become mine to carry for the rest of my life. Decision no parent ever wants to face, a choice balanced painfully between love and responsibility. Protecting your child is natural when they are young, when mistakes are small, and the world still allows room for forgiveness. But when those mistakes grow into something larger, something that affects other people and threatens the stability of your own life, the meaning of protection begins to change. Sometimes protecting someone means preventing them from falling. Other times, it means allowing them to face the consequences that might finally teach them how to stand on their own. That evening, I called Emily again, not because I needed advice, but because I needed to hear another voice in the quiet house. She listened patiently while I explained the rest of my conversation with Caroline. And when I finished, she remained silent for a moment before asking the question I had been avoiding all night. "What are you going to do, Mom?" I leaned back in my chair and looked around the kitchen where my daughters had grown up, remembering school mornings, birthday cakes, and all the ordinary moments that build a family's life together. "No yet," I admitted slowly, "but I think Caroline believes I'll protect her no matter what." She sighed softly on the other end of the line. Probably does, she said gently. You've always protected us. Words were not meant as criticism, yet they forced me to see the situation from a different angle. Caroline had not only been hiding the truth from me, she had been counting on my love to shield her once the truth finally surfaced. First time since the story began, I started to understand that the hardest part was still waiting in front of me. The next step would not be about discovering what Caroline had done. The following morning, I returned to the bank earlier than I had planned, arriving just after the doors opened, while the building was still quiet and the lobby nearly empty. Daniel greeted me with the same calm professionalism he had shown during our earlier meetings. But I could tell from the way he studied my expression that he understood the purpose of my visit before I even sat down. There are moments in life when decisions reveal themselves simply through the way someone walks into a room, and this was clearly one of them. Explained that I had spoken with Caroline the night before, and that she had finally admitted the investment deal she had been describing for months did not exist. Daniel listened carefully while I spoke, occasionally nodding while typing notes into the computer beside him. When I finished, the room fell quiet for a moment before he asked the question that would determine what happened next. Taker, he said gently, are you prepared to file an identity fraud report? Words hung in the air between us. I had spent the entire night thinking about that exact moment, weighing every possible outcome and imagining how the decision might change my daughter's future. A part of me still wanted to protect her the way I had protected her when she was young, stepping in quietly and solving the problem before anyone else could see it. But another part of me understood something that had become impossible to ignore. Mine had not simply made a mistake. She had built a situation that would continue hurting people until someone finally stopped it. I said quietly. The word felt heavy leaving my mouth, yet it also carried a strange sense of finality that made the situation clearer than it had been in days. Daniel nodded respectfully and began explaining the process that would follow, the documentation required to begin the investigation, and the steps lenders would take to examine the loan applications connected to my name. It was a long conversation filled with procedures and legal terms, yet my mind kept returning to one simple realization. First time since the debt appeared on my account, the truth was no longer hidden. Evening, Caroline called again. Her voice sounded softer than usual, as though she already sensed what had happened during my visit to the bank. She said slowly, "Did you talk to them today?" I answered. There was a brief pause before she asked the question that had clearly been sitting in her mind since the moment she dialed my number. Report it. For a moment, I closed my eyes before answering, knowing that the next word would change our relationship in ways neither of us fully understood yet. I said quietly. The silence that followed was long but not explosive. When Caroline finally spoke again, the tone in her voice carried something new, something I had not heard during any of our earlier conversations. I understand, she said softly. Those two words surprised me more than anything else she could have said. For the first time since the truth had surfaced, she was no longer trying to convince me that everything would somehow fix itself if we just waited long enough. Meant for it to go this far, she continued slowly. I kept thinking I could solve it before anyone found out. I replied gently. And as the conversation ended and the quiet house returned around me, I realized something